Something is happening inside the PGA Tour right now that nobody saw coming, and the man at the center of it is the last person anyone expected to be standing there. Rory McIlroy spent 3 years as the public face of this tour. When LIV Golf came hunting for players, Rory held the line. When the framework agreement fell apart, Rory took the heat. When other stars went quiet, Rory kept talking. He defended this organization when it wasn't easy, and he did it in front of every microphone that was put in front of him. So when Rory walks into a press conference at a major championship and essentially tells the tour's own leadership that they are about to make a historic mistake, you stop. You listen, because this isn't a disgruntled player venting after a bad round. This is the man who built his reputation defending the tour now turning around and saying, "We are heading in the wrong direction." And he wasn't alone. What unfolded in the weeks surrounding the tour's biggest structural announcement in a generation quietly pulled in some of the most powerful names in the sport, voices that don't speak up lightly, figures whose silence is usually the loudest thing in the room. Personally, I think what Rory said publicly took real courage, and I think the tour's leadership underestimated how deep this resistance actually ran. Do you agree? Or do you think the players should have trusted the process? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you stand. If you follow the PGA Tour closely and want real conversations about everything happening behind the scenes, subscribe to the channel. That's exactly what we're here for. Now, what exactly is this two-track system? Who stood alongside Rory? And why was the commissioner suddenly in damage control mode? That's what we're getting into. And the full picture is more complicated and more dramatic than the headlines suggested. To understand why Rory's words landed like a grenade, you have to understand what the tour was trying to solve, and why the solution they chose is making some of the biggest names in the sport deeply uncomfortable. Cast your mind back to 2022. LIV Golf arrives with Saudi money and guaranteed contracts that made even the most loyal tour players stop and think. The tour panicked and responded the only way they could in the moment. Slashed fields, inflated purses, built the signature events model where the elite played in small, protected fields for enormous prize funds while everyone else competed in a parallel universe for significantly less money. It worked. The tour kept its stars. LIV never fully broke through. But here's what nobody was asking loudly enough at the time. What happens when the emergency ends? By late 2025, LIV's Saudi funding was quietly drying up. The threat that justified every radical change the tour made was visibly weakening. And this is the moment that matters. Because what a reasonable organization does when the emergency passes is exhale, reassess, maybe walk some of those emergency measures back towards something more sustainable. That is not what happened. Instead, the tour looked at everything they had built under pressure, the inflated purses, the protected fields, the two-tier reality that already existed in practice, and decided to make it permanent. Then they decided to make it even more extreme. Every player on tour felt that decision differently, but one player felt it in a way that nobody inside headquarters had fully prepared for. That decision is what put Rory McIlroy in that press conference chair with fury in his eyes. What he said next stopped the entire golf world mid-sentence. At the US Open at Shinnecock Hills, Rory said something that most players in his position would never say publicly. He said the way the tour was structured before LIV arrived was actually pretty good. Think about what that means coming from him specifically. 3 years of public defense. 3 years of telling anyone who would listen that the tour was worth fighting for, worth the sacrifice, worth the chaos. And now he was quietly suggesting that the cure might be worse than the disease. But to understand exactly why those words carried so much weight, you first need to understand what this new system actually does. Because once you see the specific details, the reason so many people inside the sport went silent with concern becomes very clear. The plan has 2 tiers. The Championship Series sits at the top, roughly 23 to 24 events, purses of at least $20 million each, fields capped at around 120 players. The Players' Championship is in there. The majors count toward it. The big international team events sit alongside it. On paper, it looks like the elite-level professional golf always should have had. Then there is the Challenger Series, at least 20 events, purses starting at $4 million. Venues described by tour officials as places you would recognize, which is carefully chosen language that stops well short of saying Pebble Beach, Riviera, or Augusta National. And sitting between those 2 tiers is the detail that made players and agents go very quiet when they first heard it. The promotion and relegation mechanic. Finish inside the top 90 on the Championship Series points list, and you keep your place for next season. Finish 91st or worse, and you are relegated. Not quietly reassigned, relegated. The same word used when a football club falls out of the Premier League after decades of competing at the highest level. Relegated players do get one final opportunity, a short domestic series of 4 to 6 fall events that functions as a last-chance qualifier. Miss that cut and you spend the following year in the Challenger Series, competing for a fraction of the money, at events with a fraction of the profile, trying to earn your way back. For a sport that has never used relegation in its history, that single mechanic changes everything about how a professional golfer thinks about every single round he plays. The names who understood that fastest are the ones who started speaking out, and what they actually said is far more pointed than most people realize. Rory McIlroy had been part of the 9-member Future Competition Committee that spent months building this framework. Tiger Woods chaired it. Patrick Cantlay, Adam Scott, and Maverick McNeely sat on it alongside business figures brought in from outside the sport. Rory was involved throughout. He understood the architecture better than almost anyone outside tour headquarters, which makes what he said publicly at Shinnecock Hills even more striking. He didn't just question the Challenger Series in passing. He named a specific tournament to illustrate his concern, the Canadian Open, one of the oldest national opens in professional golf, a tournament with genuine history and genuine meaning on the international calendar. And Rory looked at the cameras and said that an event like the Canadian Open potentially becoming a Challenger Series event would be like sending it to a glorified Corn Ferry tour. Those 5 words, glorified Corn Ferry event, immediately became the phrase that defined the entire debate, because every diehard golf fan in the world knows exactly what the Corn Ferry Tour is. They know the difference between watching stars compete at Riviera and watching developing players grind through a Tuesday qualifier in a mid-sized city. Rory wasn't being dramatic. He was being precise, and that precision is what made the phrase so damaging. He then went further. He pointed out that sponsors willing to pay $30 million would land on the Championship Series. Sponsors who couldn't or wouldn't match that number would end up on the Challenger Series by default, regardless of how historic their event was, regardless of how much the tour had previously valued their commitment. Money, not legacy, would determine where your tournament sat in the new structure. The tour's commissioner needed a response. What he actually did when the cameras turned on him revealed exactly how much pressure had built behind closed doors. And he wasn't the only one under it. Brian Rolapp built this plan with Tiger Woods. He staked his early tenure on it. He went public with the framework at the Players' Championship in March 2026, months before the official vote. This was meant to be the defining moment of his leadership, the announcement that proved a new era of professional golf had arrived with clarity and ambition. Then Rory called it a glorified Corn Ferry event in front of the world's golf media, 1 week before the official announcement was scheduled. Rolapp had to personally call Rory before the press conference. Not a text, not a message through an intermediary. A direct call, because the tour's most important player had just publicly questioned the legitimacy of the most important thing the new commissioner had ever built. When Rolapp faced reporters at the Travelers' Championship on June 23rd, he had to defend the Challenger Series before anyone even asked him about the golf. His argument was that Challenger Series venues would be recognizable, that purses would be healthy, that the same pool of roughly 200 tour members would simply be competing across both tiers rather than being split into separate rosters. He pushed back on the Corn Ferry comparison directly and firmly. He also made one telling decision. He dropped the language of Track 1 and Track 2 entirely. The rebranding to Championship Series and Challenger Series was announced as part of the official rollout, but it was not cosmetic. Track 2 had become radioactive in the golf conversation the moment Rory attached glorified Corn Ferry to it. Rolapp understood that the framing had already been lost and moved quickly to replace it with something that carried less baggage. What Rolapp could not control was how many other voices were already saying the same thing Rory had said, just more quietly, and from positions that made the resistance even harder to dismiss. Jack Nicklaus stood at his own tournament, the Memorial, and told reporters he was not exactly in favor of what the tour was doing right now. He said he hated seeing too many big events bunched too closely together, and warned it would become a long-term problem. 18 major championships. The man who helped define what professional golf looked like for half a century, and he was signaling publicly that something about this plan felt wrong. Justin Thomas, a player advisory council member and a major champion, had been raising concerns about player representation in how the structure was being shaped. Jordan Spieth, also on the advisory council, was asking practical questions about what happens when championship series rules prevent a star from supporting a tournament in his own city, an event that had backed him through the early years of his career. Patrick Cantlay, who actually sat inside the Future Competition Committee and helped build this plan from the ground up, was simultaneously known as the locker room's most skeptical voice on tour governance decisions. The man who led the FedEx Cup bonus dispute in 2022 was now sitting in the room where the biggest structural change in tour history was being designed. That combination of inside access and well-documented skepticism made his presence on that committee one of the most quietly significant details of this entire story. Sponsors were pushing back harder than the tour had anticipated. The private message coming from tournament operators potentially facing Challenger Series designation was pointed. Why would they commit millions of dollars in prize money and infrastructure to what might effectively become a feeder league? Broadcast partners were asking what exactly their existing rights agreements were paying for under a restructured calendar. And inside the locker room, anonymous players were telling media that the whole thing felt like the Corn Ferry tour with better prize money attached. That is not a coordinated public revolt. That is an entire ecosystem. Players, legends, sponsors, operators, broadcasters, and the locker room itself, quietly signaling that the plan had not landed the way the tour's leadership expected it to. Now here is the part of this story that almost nobody has properly examined, and it reframes everything you just heard in a way that makes the whole situation significantly more complicated. After the official announcement on June 23rd, after the vote was passed at the Travelers Championship, after Rolapp defended the Challenger Series in front of the cameras, Rory McIlroy released a statement. He called it a positive step for professional golf. He said the commitment to elevating historic international tournaments and national opens was something he was very supportive of. He described his work on the Future Competition Committee as a privilege. He said he was proud of what the committee had built for future generations of players and fans. The man who called Track 2 a glorified Corn Ferry event turned around after the official announcement and endorsed it. That is not a contradiction. That is how golf's internal politics actually work, and understanding it tells you something important about where professional golf actually stands right now. Rory's public criticism before the announcement was not a revolt that failed. It was pressure applied at exactly the right moment, by exactly the right person, to shape the final details of something he had helped build from the inside. The Canadian Open specifically received renewed commitment from tour leadership around the time of the announcement. The language around historic national opens shifted noticeably. The rebranding happened faster than anyone expected. Whether Rory got everything he was pushing for, or whether he made peace with something he still privately questions, that conversation will play out over the next 2 seasons as the system moves toward its 2028 implementation date. Because the first relegation hasn't happened yet. The first player to finish 91st and lose their championship series status hasn't been named. The first historic tournament to land in the Challenger Series despite decades of tour history hasn't been announced. The first sponsor to walk away because the tier designation didn't match what they were paying for hasn't left yet. The real consequences of this system are still coming. And when they arrive, when real names get relegated, when real tournaments feel the drop in prestige, when the locker room sees the promotion and relegation mechanic play out for the first time in professional golf history, the conversation Rory started at Shinnecock Hills is going to feel like the opening paragraph of a much longer story. The question is not whether this system will be tested. Every system gets tested. The real question is whether the tour built something strong enough to survive what's coming, or whether the voices who pushed back end up being proved right when it matters most. That is the question I would love to hear your answer on. Do you think the 2-track system is the future professional golf actually needed? Or did the tour just solve one problem by quietly creating a bigger one? Tell me in the comments below, because on a topic this significant, your perspective genuinely matters to how this channel covers the story going forward.